All right, so thanks for attending my talk. I'm going to be talking about automating content management for Tableau Server today. My name is Mark Jacobson, and I'm a solution architect at Slalom. And you can follow me on Twitter at Visibly Different. I also blog with the same handle, so I'll have a couple links up at the end. But yeah, so let's get into it. So I am a server nerd at heart, and one of the things that really gets me going is being able to provide the platform by which all of you people build fantastic data visualizations and share them with others within your companies, your teams. And what I really care about is making that platform the most available, the highest performing, so that when somebody interacts with the visualization that you spent a lot of time building, that they get the best experience. And so this is really a talk about the overall health of a Tableau server and how we can use content management strategies, specifically automating them, to keep that environment always performing at its highest capacity. So without further ado, I'll start with the content lifecycle. So you work hard to plan, develop, and test your content. And when you're ready, to share it with other people, you publish it to your Tableau server, and you make it, you put it into users' hands so that they can go ahead and test the things that you built. After they sign off on it, usually it'll get promoted into production, whether it's a different server or another project folder somewhere else on your Tableau server. And then this is really where users will get hands-on with it, start diving into the content to really try to extract insights that are going to impact their business. But what happens next? How do you know if that content is being used? What if the question that your visualization was built to answer is no longer relevant and your workbooks are going unused? So really, how can you manage your content at scale? And that's really what we're going to be talking about today, is how do you manage it as the volume of content on your Tableau server grows over time, as more people come onto the server, as they start producing more visualizations? How do you know that you're always, you have people looking at the stuff that's really relevant? So Tableau does a little bit of this today. It has some built-in tools that can help with this. One of those is content analytics. With content analytics, we can see usage trends over time and total views for workbooks and data sources. So we get an idea of, is usage trending upward? Is it trending downward? Are people even opening, stuff that you've built? It's really nice the way they've baked it into a server. But it's really only like at the surface level, right? What are some other ways? Server monitoring dashboards. We can assess which content is consuming the most space on a server, or how long it's been since it's been refreshed. We can even design our own custom monitoring dashboards based off of the POSTGRES database that's inside a Tableau server, and a lot of people have done this to date. There's a ton of great stuff out there. So that's yet another way that we can see how Tableau enables this today. And the third way is through data-driven alerts. Starting with Tableau 10.3, you can set alerts that'll notify you when data changes, when it meets or exceeds a given threshold, or even when an extract refresh has failed. But what if Tableau could intelligently detect unused content, determine how to manage it, or even do that automatically? Well, guess what? It can. Through the use of Tableau servers, APIs, and some code that we will write, we can program Tableau to do all of that. So here you see an app that I've built using Tableau's APIs to do exactly what I've been talking about, is to manage the Tableau content on your server automatically. Here you can see it's scrolling through a variety of settings that can be customized based on your server and your company's content retention policies. And today I'm going to walk through how I built this and even share some resources and some code that you can use to build something yourself. But first, I want to talk about the Tableau Dev Toolbox and what we're really going to need to be able to build our own content management tool. The first thing we'll start with are languages, programming languages. So for this, we'll need to use some SQL and have access to the Tableau server's Postgres database. So we're going to dive deep on Postgres so we can review content usage patterns and get information about schedule details. We're We're also going to use a heavy bit of Python. I chose Python, but you could use any language that supports connections to databases and that can submit HTTP requests for working with Tableau's APIs. You can use JavaScript. In this case, we are going to use JavaScript because we're going to walk through a front-end application framework that we just saw there in that video. And then we're also going to need some HTML and CSS. But we'll also need a few other tools that we're going to work with. So we'll need Tableau Server's REST API for getting our whitelisted content, downloading workbooks and data sources, deleting content from the server. We'll also look at what is known as the VIZPORTAL API, or the Tableau's undocumented API, to do some things that aren't available with Tableau's REST API. And then the last two are some JavaScript frameworks, most notably Node.js and ELECTRON.js, that will enable us to build out the front-end application and do some of the tasks that we need to do. And the last piece we'll need is just some general knowledge of JSON, JavaScript object notation, a way to hold key value pairs. Arrays, we're going to have lists of information that we want to be able to iterate through because we're going to have some repetitive tasks. And then the last one is YAML, and this is a basic format that we're going to use to create some configuration files that will drive our entire application. But before we get into the code and start looking at all that, I think we really need to define our feature set. Knowing what features that you want to build out is going to help you focus on an outcome rather than chasing after things that might only have marginal value. So through the work that I've done for my clients, I get to see a variety of content management challenges. And the ones that we're going to show here are the ones that I've chosen to build around because I think they apply to the widest range of Tableau environments. So what we're going to build out is the ability to check for a piece of content, whether it's a workbook or a data source, that hasn't been used in N days. And I say N days because we want it to be configurable. We want to be able to whitelist content that shouldn't be altered. So this could be a viz that's been produced for CEO, and you know that that person looks at it all the time, and you want it to be safeguarded from an automated tool that's going to pick up a workbook and remove it, and then you're going to get an angry phone call from the CEO. So we want to be able to tag content that shouldn't be altered. And then for each piece of content that we identify, we want to determine a course of action that we're going to take based on that period of inactivity. And that could be, we want to disable the extract schedule on the server so that it doesn't run. We want to remove the content from the server entirely because people aren't using it anymore. Or maybe we want to reschedule that extract to run at a more efficient time slot based on, when's people need it by, or how often is it being looked at. If it's a viz that's only used once a quarter, do we need it to run every single day? Probably not. And then the last piece is we want to notify content owners of the modifications that are being made, so that you don't get an angry email or phone call from someone saying, hey, what did you do with my viz or my data source? We also want to map out our workflow. Before we start coding, I really recommend going through this process. The app that we're talking about today, I've codenamed it Sheriff. It's kind of a traffic cop that looks for unused content. But I had a loose idea when I began coding it and of how I wanted it to work, but I didn't initially take the time to map it out. And this led to a lot of rewrites and wasted cycles that I probably could have avoided if I had just taken the time to diagram out my workflow. So a lot of what the Sheriff app does is repetitive, and having this workflow defined helps to visualize the order of operations. Since we're working with an entire Tableau server in this case, we really we want to start by getting a list of the sites that are on that server, and then we're going to start looping through content. So you'll see here, one of the first tasks is to get a list of sites and then get the unused workbooks. And then this enters into a giant loop here. And so for each site that we have on our server, we want to perform these same actions. And then once we dive into each site, we're really looking at the content within it. And we want to make sure that each piece of content we take a specific action on it based on criteria that we set. So once we have this workflow defined, we can start to build out our configuration. But in this case, we've got here, kind of what does the workflow look like? And I know it's a little hard to follow here. This is also available on my blog as well. So you can really dissect it and see what are all the different decision points on how we should take action with a piece of content, and then ultimately end up performing some task via the APIs. Okay, so I mentioned having a central config is really a critical component to this, or a really helpful one. I think to save time and not to be redundant as you're writing your code, having all of your settings in a single file really makes it easy to reuse things. So I like using YAML for this because it's really clean and really easy to modify, and it works well with Python. So you can see this is just kind of an indented format where we've got our Tableau server settings filled out. We've got settings for connecting to Tableau server's PostGRES environment. Now, these will vary based on your server's configuration. But I think the important message here is also to make sure you use an admin account when you're doing a lot of these tasks, because you can run into permissions issues if you're only using just a interactor editor user, or even a site admin. Site admins do have a lot of privileges, but we're going to be working with a lot of server level stuff. So having an admin account is really important here. We'll also need to configure where we're going to store content that we download from the server. Our app is going to allow us to download a piece of content and email it to a user, so we want to have a place to download that stuff. And so we'll also need to have email settings in here. And then the last piece are the schedule settings. And I'll talk a little bit more about this later on, but this is really where we define the criteria for how we govern the actions that we take based around a workbook or a data source. Okay, so PostGRES, the first Tableau tool that we're going to look at. Under the hood of every Tableau server instance is a PostGRES database that captures server configuration and metadata about the content that's on it, and you have the ability to query it. But why do we need to access the PostGRES database? Well, for our application, we need to get server content usage information. So not everything's available from the REST API, but PostGRES has all of that information about the content and its usage. And in order to use the VIZPORTAL API, there are some ID values that only exist within the PostGRES database that we'll need to reference. So what can we get from PostGRES? What does PostGRES have that we want from it? Site details, information about the sites so that we can iterate through each of them. It'll tell us which content hasn't been used. By querying the view stats and the data source stats tables, we can identify which workbooks and data sources haven't met our criteria for minimum usage. We'll also get details on who the users are, so we can contact content owners and provide them with that explanation of why we're modifying their content. And we also want to know server schedule details. We want to be able to reschedule content, so we need to know what schedules are available on our Tableau server. And then the last piece are the schedule details around an existing piece of content. This will let us know exactly how frequently something is being updated. And if you follow this link to my blog, I've also got a lot of the PostGRES code samples up there. I won't be showing any of those in the presentation today, but they are all freely available up there for download. The next Tableau tool that we're going to take a look at is the REST API. And with this, you can manage and change resources programmatically on your Tableau server. The API gives you simple access to functionality behind data sources, projects, workbooks, site users, and sites on your server. And you can access this to create your own custom applications like we're going to look at today. So how are we going to use it? We're going to use it to query information about content on the Tableau server. We'll also use it to download content. We'll use it to download some images from our workbooks. We're also going to use it to remove content from the server. And again, I have some sample code on how to structure these calls also on my blog. And the last Tableau tool that we're going to need is the VIZPORTAL API, or the undocumented API. And the reason we need to use the VIZPORTAL API is because there are certain operations that we cannot perform using the REST API that Tableau makes available to us. And you might ask, what are those things? What can't we do that we kind of need to use this undocumented backdoor into Tableau server? One of those would be to update extract schedules. If you wanted to change a extract that's running, Monday morning at 8 o'clock to running once a week at 6 a.m., you can't do that using the REST API. You'd have to use the VIZPORTAL API to do it. And we also want to be able to delete extract tasks. Not necessarily delete the content from the server. We want to preserve it on the server, but to actually delete the extract refresh, we would need to go in with the VIZPORTAL API to do that. So it's time to connect the dots. We've talked about a lot of tools, but how do we put all of this stuff together in order to create the app that we were talking about? So I mentioned there was a section at the end of that YAML file that really is the key part that governs how the application functions. And it translates to this table. Really what it is looking at, how long has it been since a view or a workbook was last viewed or a data source was last accessed? What is the current schedule by which something is set to refresh? And then a recommended action that we want to take depending, on how long it has been. So this is sort of the default configuration that I use, but it can be customized based on your team's needs. The basic premise here is to move a schedule up one level. So if something is set to refresh weekly, we would move it to monthly. If it's set to refresh daily, we'd move it to weekly, and so on. But the kind of guiding principle around this is not to, drastically move somebody's content to a schedule that maybe doesn't make sense. These can be tweaked and refined, but I tend to stick with this because I think it creates a more balanced server and really helps reclaim a lot of those resources that are being used to unnecessarily update content that people maybe aren't looking at as frequently. So translating that table into something that we can programmatically work through, I'm using, in this case, because I wrote my app in Python, I'm using what's known as a class object. And this allows us to define a specific action that we can take for every single piece of content. So this is something that gets called through the course of our code that says, okay, here's a piece of content. Tell me what I'm supposed to do with it. So it looks at those settings that we just had in that table. And it says, okay, tell me the reference point. How many days has it been since this has last been viewed? And then does a lookup against our table with the rules in it. And it says, okay, I'm either going to do nothing with it because it doesn't, violate any of the policies that are in there, or I need to disable it, reschedule it, or just remove it. And what this will do is it will return an action that we can then pass to our API calls or to the appropriate API call. So that we can take that action for the content. The last piece that we need to go through is how to package this all up into that pretty app that we all saw. So building the application, I used a framework called ELECTRON.js, and you may never have heard of ELECTRON.js, but you may be familiar with things that actually are built on it. So let's first talk about what is ELECTRON. ELECTRON is a cross-platform library that allows you to build apps using nothing more than JavaScript, HTML, and CSS. And it's a really quick way to start building an application that you can connect to almost anything. So I mentioned, you may be already familiar with ELECTRON through some apps that you're using. Some of those include Atom and VS Code. These are code editors that are commonly used. Even if your company uses Slack, they have a desktop app. That app was built on ELECTRON. Maybe even lesser known is a program that I use called Interact. If you work with Python, you're familiar with like Jupyter notebooks or IPython notebooks, Interact is a program that allows you to run those easily. That is also built on the Electron framework. And Postman is an app used for exploring API calls and the like. And so to get started with Electron, you can learn more about it at electronjs.org or electronforge.io, but it's really as simple as 4 lines of code. So if you've ever used, there's a package called npm. It's part of Node.js, and it is it's a command line utility, but it's an easy way to install packages that other people in the JavaScript or the Node community have developed. And with 4 lines of code, you can set up a shell app that's just a kind of a blank window that you can customize with your own HTML and your own JavaScript calls to start interacting and build out the application. And so that really forms the basis of how I built Sheriff. This stuff all comes together. So this window that we're looking at, this is built off of Electron, and then each of the different windows or pages that you see in the tab are different HTML documents. It's all linked together with JavaScript, with Node, and various libraries that are available to control Postgres or to control interact with YAML and feed these calls back and forth to each other. So that kind of concludes my my talk, and thanks everyone for tuning in. Again, you can find me on Twitter at Visibly Different or my blog at visiblydifferent.github.io. And I'll turn it over for questions now.
So Mark, Fee has asked, she first started off, "Hey Mark, great presentation. With changing the schedules automatically, let's say if it hasn't been used for 2 weeks, changing refresh to weekly, do you have some form of communication for end users to let them know that that the data isn't updated?"
It's not in here right now, but you could add that in. So one of the things that I had mentioned was, the ability to email a content owner, and let them know, hey, we're modifying your content. Here's sort of the reason why, explaining, your content hasn't been used in, N number of days. This is what the policy is. You can customize that message or that workflow to give somebody a heads up that you're going to touch something of theirs. Some of the things I've also heard other people doing with the APIs is integrating it. Like if your company uses Slack or some other IM client, is integrating it with your company's IM to like shoot them a note that says, hey, this program has identified, that your content needs to be rescheduled or removed or whatever. And that kind of gives them a heads up to maybe take the action on their own to change the schedule so that, it doesn't get modified by a tool.
Let's see. Oh, just so that you know, in the chat, Michael Moran, I'm sorry if I mispronounce your name, said the tool is cool, but your ability to mentor us through the logic and tools was the best. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to echo that. I mean, I'm not a server person. I'm an end user when it comes to Tableau at work, but the way that you walked through everything was phenomenal.
Thank you. Yeah, it's something that I really love to talk about. I love to share what I've learned. I think so much of what I do when it comes to server is really about sharing that knowledge back with the community. I've learned so much from everybody here. A lot of the work that led into this was I was really inspired by a talk that Craig Bloodworth did at TC16 when he first showed off Tab Communicate, and it was like hey, here's this easy way to start investigating, Tableau's APIs. And that conversation that talk was like a light bulb went off in my head. So I really wanted to do the same thing and give back to the community.
Awesome. I'm just trying to look through chat to see if there's any other questions for you.
You mentioned Craig Bloodworth, who's another server person that you kind of admire or look up to.
Yeah, definitely. Sorry, was there a question in that?
Yeah, who do you admire out in the community or respect, kind of get some ideas from on
Yeah, I think the initial or the bits in here about the VIZPORTAL API, this was kind of an interesting path for me because I really wanted to build out this tool for a long time. It had originally started as just a set of dashboards that were built on top of the Postgres database and to identify where there may be problems within the Tableau server. And while that was really great information to have, the follow-up action all had to be done manually. And when I thought about automating it, I started digging into it and I quickly discovered that the big things I wanted to automate, I couldn't do, and I needed this VIZPORTAL API. So, I've benefited or, really learned so much from Craig and from Tomas Foldy and from Chris Toomey. Those guys have really been great mentors for me and people to bounce ideas off of.